Hey guy, welcome back to Sleep Among Titans, where we drift through strange and quiet corners of the past, perfect for listening before you sleep. Tonight, we're going to a place you probably know well, the beaches of Normandy on June 6th, 1944. But we're not landing in a Higgins boat. We're not storming a cliff. We're going to turn the camera around and sit on the other side. We're going to spend some time with the guys who were told the invasion was impossible right before the impossible happened. I always love to see how far these stories travel across the globe. So as you get comfortable, feel free to leave a comment and let us know where you're listening from tonight. Now let's go there. The air is cold. It's the first few hours of what will become the longest day. We're inside a concrete bunker, a single link in the chain of the much-hyped Atlantic Wall, a fortification system that was on paper a masterpiece of German engineering, but in practice was about to become the most tragically porous fence in history. Inside, the air tastes of damp concrete and salt. Here sits a young soldier, let's call him Klaus. He's 17. For months, his greatest enemy has been the relentless boredom. As he stares into the blackness over the English Channel, he isn't contemplating grand strategy. He's thinking about home. He's remembering the feeling of dry socks. Klaus has no idea that the man in charge of his defense, Field Marshal Rommel, is hundreds of miles away planning a birthday surprise for his wife. He doesn't know that in just a few moments the sky will begin to hum with a sound he's never heard before, the sound of thousands of engines carrying tens of thousands of men. For now, there is only the quiet rhythm of the waves, a peace that is already a ghost. This fragile peace was kept by the Atlantic Wall itself. You have to imagine this thing a long sleeping serpent of concrete and steel winding its way down the coast of Europe. It was meant to be the definitive statement in coastal defense, a final unbreachable keep out sign written in thousands of tons of concrete. It was Germany's great insurance policy against invasion. And like with many insurance policies, the fine print, the parts about gaps in the line, missing air support, and sleepy sentries was about to become very important. For the men stationed here, life was a strange cocktail of military pride and profound soul-crushing boredom. They were guardians of an invincible fortress, yet their days were spent fighting a slow war against saltwater rust and their own dwindling morale. It was a strange existence, living in a concrete shell while overlooking some of the most beautiful coastline in the world, a postcard from a life they no longer had. And that postcard from a life they no longer had was its own special kind of torture. Because while the world outside their concrete slit of a window was alive with seasons, with green fields and golden harvests, their world was a constant, unchanging gray. Gray concrete, gray sea, gray sky, gray uniforms. And that monotonous gray had a rhythm all its own. This was the rhythm of waiting. It began before dawn, not with a bugle's cry, but with a collective, involuntary shiver. It was a deep, damp cold that seemed to radiate from the concrete itself, a chill that the morning's coffee, a bitter, watery brew that tasted more of the pot than the bean, could never quite chase away. The first real order of the day wasn't to man your battle stations, but to fight the rust. You see, the Great Atlantic Wall had a more immediate and tireless enemy than the Allied forces, the Atlantic Ocean itself. The salt air was a patient, microscopic saboteur. It crept into every mechanism, every hinge, painting a fine orange fur of decay on pristine rifle barrels and carefully oiled machine gun parts. So these young men, who had been trained for the lightning warfare of the Blitzkrieg, found themselves in a slow, grinding and ultimately losing battle with basic chemistry. They would spend hours polishing their Mauser rifles to a perfect gleam, only to feel the faint, gritty texture of new rust beginning to form just a day later. There's a particular hollow irony in meticulously preparing a weapon for a war that feels like a myth, only to watch that same weapon be slowly consumed by the scenery. The afternoons were dedicated to the more strategic battle against madness. In a corner of the main casemate, away from the silent, imposing gun that pointed uselessly out to sea, you would almost always find a game of cards in progress. Usually, Skat played with a deck that was soft and worn. The kings and queens faded like old ghosts. Here, the real stakes weren't the small denomination Reichsmarks they used as chips, but the trade of rumors and stories. An older sergeant, a man named Manfred with weary eyes that had seen the endless snows of the Russian front, might grumble about the new recruits. "They think the war is about keeping your boots clean," he'd say, shaking his head as he played a card. Klaus, our young sentry from earlier, would sit at the edge of the game listening, trying to absorb the casual cynicism of the veterans as a kind of armor. They'd trade dark jokes, complain about the food, the quality of the sausage was a subject of near-constant theological debate, and speculate about when or if the Tommies and Amys would ever actually show up. The consensus, reinforced by weeks of utter silence from the sea, was never. Why would they? Manfred would argue, gesturing with his thumb at the thick concrete ceiling. It's a suicide run. They're not that stupid. And everyone would nod. It was a comforting thought. A dangerously comforting one. But perhaps the truest, most revealing moments of this rhythm happened when a soldier was alone with a pen and a piece of cheap paper. Writing a letter home was the most difficult duty of all because it was an act of pure fiction. You couldn't write the truth. You couldn't write, "Dear Mother, I am cold, perpetually damp, and my cough won't go away. I'm lonely, and sometimes at night the sound of the ocean is so loud it feels like I'm drowning. I'm scared." No, you couldn't send that truth across the sea. It was too heavy. It would sink the envelope. So instead, you dipped your pen in the ink pot, and you built a fantasy. Dearest Mother. Klaus might write, his breath misting in the bunker's chill. The sea air here is wonderful, so bracing. We are eating well and staying busy. The French countryside is as pretty as they say in the books. How is the harvest coming along? Give my love to everyone at home. Every cheerful word was a small betrayal of his reality. Every casual question about life back home was a wall he built to protect the people he loved from the grim truth of his own. He would write about the future, about what he'd do when he came home, as if it were a certainty, a scheduled event like a train departure. He'd fold the letter, seal it, and for a brief, flickering moment, the fantasy felt real. He was just a boy away from home on a long trip, not a cog in a vast war machine sitting on the edge of the world waiting. This was the rhythm of waiting, a cycle of cleaning card games and carefully constructed lies. And with every passing peaceful day, the prospect of a real invasion seemed more and more absurd, a ghost story the officers told to keep them from getting too complacent. This concrete serpent had been sleeping for so long the men inside had almost forgotten it was supposed to be dangerous. They put their faith in the concrete and in the big guns they so diligently polished. They had no way of knowing that their high command was putting its faith in something far more fickle, the weather forecast, which had confidently promised rough seas and storms for the first week of June. And the sea itself, their constant companion and their slow, corrosive enemy, was keeping a terrible secret, hiding a fleet larger than the world had ever seen just over that gray horizon. But the sea, for all its secrets, would not be the first to give the game away. The first warning didn't come from the waves crashing on the shore below. It came impossibly from the quiet moonlit sky. Imagine Klaus again, our young sentry, back on his late-night watch. The damp chill has settled deep into his bones by now. He's counting the minutes until his shift ends, his mind on a warm bunk and the oblivion of sleep. And then he feels it as much as he hears it. It starts so subtly, he thinks he's imagining it, a low hum deeper than the wind, more constant than the sea. It's not the familiar angry buzz of a lone reconnaissance plane. This is different. This sound, it grows. It builds from a faint vibration felt in the teeth to a deep resonant drone that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It's as if the sky itself had developed a pulse, a steady mechanical heartbeat. He's not the only one. Other soldiers begin to stir, stumbling out of their bunks, pulling on their greatcoats. Their faces are pale and questioning in the dim bunker light. Is it ours? Someone finally whispers, the question hanging in the air. It has to be right. The Luftwaffe showing off a massive unannounced transfer of planes to a new airfield. They cling to these rational explanations because the alternative is simply unthinkable. Then through a break in the clouds they see them. The moon illuminates a patch of sky, and against that pale light they pass. Not one plane, not 10, but a river of them. An endless black river of C-47 transport planes flying low and heavy, flowing steadily east into the heart of Normandy. The sheer relentless scale of it is humbling. It's a silent, overwhelming spectacle of power that makes their concrete bunker, their formidable Atlantic wall, feel suddenly terrifyingly small. The river of planes eventually passes, but the drone remains a permanent feature of the night sky. And then the field telephone and the radio begin to crackle to life with panicked, nonsensical reports. Paratroopers. They are landing everywhere. Near the crossroads town of Sainte-Mère-Église, near the vital bridges at Ranville. But the reports are bizarre contradictory. Some units report engaging in fierce firefights in the dark. Others report finding something much, much stranger. They're finding enemy soldiers, the reports claim, but they're dolls. They were officially codenamed Ruperts. Imagine the profound confusion for a German patrol creeping through a dark Norman forest. They hear gunfire and explosions. They prepare for a desperate ambush, and what they find is a 6-foot-tall burlap dummy dressed in a paratrooper's uniform hanging from a tree, its leg rigged with firecrackers to simulate the sound of battle. Is this the invasion? A grotesque prank? A new and baffling form of psychological warfare designed to make them question their own sanity? The Allies had filled the first wave not just with elite soldiers, but with ghosts and puppets, sowing a powerful seed of pure, unadulterated confusion. And it worked perfectly. The comfortable gray boredom that had defined life in the bunker for months is gone, shattered completely. It has been replaced by a new kind of atmosphere, a tense, wide-eyed state of anxious listening. The Skat cards lie forgotten on the table. The half-written letters home are put away. Every man in the bunker is now an ear straining to understand the night. They listen to the unending drone from the sky. They listen to the crackle of the radio trying to build a coherent picture from a jigsaw puzzle of panicked voices and absurd reports of phantom armies. The rhythm of waiting is over. A new rhythm has begun. The rhythm of the deep and terrifying unknown. And the silence from their own high command is rapidly becoming just as unsettling as the noise from the enemy. The men in the bunkers were on the front line of all this confusion, trying to tell the difference between a real soldier and a scarecrow in the dark. But their officers miles away in comfortable command posts were about to face an even more difficult challenge, trying to tell the difference between a limited raid, a clever diversion, and the single greatest invasion in human history. And for one officer in particular peering through a pair of powerful binoculars at the first pale light of dawn, that distinction was about to become terrifyingly, horribly clear. That officer was Major Werner Skat. He was a veteran, a professional artilleryman in charge of the guns overlooking a stretch of sand the Allies had fatefully codenamed Omaha Beach. His post wasn't a cramped, damp bunker like the one Klaus inhabited. It was a proper observation station dug into the cliffs equipped with powerful long-range optics. And as the first hint of a bleak gray dawn began to bleed across the horizon, he was doing what a good officer does. He was watching. The sea was choppy, the sky a heavy, bruised-looking gray. It was miserable weather, but in a strange way it was comforting. The official forecast from the Luftwaffe, the one that had allowed so many senior German commanders to sleep soundly in their beds, had promised even worse conditions. No one, the official thinking went, would be foolish enough to launch a major invasion in a June gale. Skat swept his high-powered artillery binoculars across the water, the lenses trying to cut through the thick sea mist. At first, there was nothing. Just an endless expanse of churning gray water. It was exactly what he expected to see. He was about to lower the binoculars, perhaps, to get a cup of that famously terrible coffee, when a patch of mist thinned for just a moment. And then he saw them. It wasn't a gradual realization. It was an instantaneous, heart-stopping physical shock. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a patrol of ships. It was, for lack of a better word, everything. A flotilla so vast, so impossibly dense that the sea itself seemed to have vanished beneath it. It was a floating city of ghosts that had materialized out of the dawn mist. Warships of every size, transports, landing craft. Thousands upon thousands of them. A forest of masts and steel hulls stretching from one end of the horizon to the other. His trained military brain struggled to process the sight. It didn't look like an invasion force. It looked like the entire world had decided to go sailing, and they had all chosen this exact spot at this exact time. For a long moment, he was paralyzed. Then training took over. He grabbed the field telephone, his hand trembling almost uncontrollably, and cranked the handle. The call was to his regimental commander. "There are ships," he said, his voice tight and strained. "Out on the horizon." The voice that came back was relaxed, still heavy with sleep. How many plus Skat? I can't count them. There are thousands. There was a skeptical pause on the other end of the line. Major, you know the mist can play tricks on you. Are you certain? Skat slammed the phone down, pressed his eyes back to the binoculars, and felt a wave of cold dread wash over him. They were real, and they were getting closer. He called again, his voice now sharp with frantic urgency. This is the invasion. I can see 10,000 ships. This is it. But the reply was still laced with a weary skepticism. They had been on high alert for weeks. There had been false alarms before. Skat was a good man, but maybe the strain was finally getting to him. The command posts had been dealing with bizarre reports of exploding scarecrows all night. A phantom fleet didn't seem entirely out of the question. Desperate Skat bypassed the chain of command and made a direct call to the 352nd Division headquarters. He got through to the commander's chief of staff, repeating his report, his words tumbling out. The entire English Channel is filled with ships. He was pleading now, the voice of a man staring at the apocalypse while trying to describe it to someone looking at a map in a quiet room miles away. The response he received was the death knell of military bureaucracy. We'll look into it. They didn't believe him. It was too big, too audacious. The German strategic plan, the one that was repeated like a prayer, was that the main invasion must come at the Pas de Calais, the shortest point across the Channel. That's where the elite panzer divisions were held in reserve. This had to be a diversion. A magnificent, terrifying diversion certainly, but a diversion nonetheless. And so Major Werner Skat stood there in his lonely observation post, a modern-day Cassandra. He had seen the future. He had screamed it into a telephone, and nobody listened. All he could do now was watch as the city of ghosts continued its slow, inexorable approach. He was one of the few men on the entire coast who knew the absolute truth of what was about to happen. But the generals who needed to act on his warning, the men who could have unleashed the tanks, well, some were asleep, some were attending war games, and one, the most important of them all, was hundreds of miles away, about to cut a birthday cake for his wife. Yes, a birthday cake. It sounds like a detail from a satirical novel, but it's the strange, tragic truth of the morning. While Major Werner Skat was watching the world end through his binoculars, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, the one man the Allied soldiers truly feared, was at his home in Herrlingen, Germany, presenting his wife Lucy with a pair of gray suede Parisian shoes he'd bought for her 51st birthday. He was there because he, like everyone else in the German High Command, had been betrayed by the weather forecast. The Kriegsmarine's meteorologists had been adamant storms would make the English Channel impassable for at least 2 weeks, so Rommel took the chance. He wanted to give his wife her gift in person, of course, but his trip had a far more urgent purpose. He planned to travel from his home to the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat, to plead, to demand, to practically beg the Führer to release the elite panzer divisions from his personal control. Rommel knew, with the keen instincts of a master tactician, that the only way to defeat an invasion was to smash it on the beaches in the first 24 hours. The tanks were the hammer he needed to do it. So in the greatest and most bitter irony of the war, on the exact morning the invasion finally began, Erwin Rommel was away from the front, trying to acquire the very tools he needed to fight it. He was a fireman who had gone to headquarters to beg for a water hose while his house hundreds of miles away was already beginning to burn down. And if Rommel was the absent fireman, the Luftwaffe was the fire department with no water in its trucks. Where were the German planes? That was the desperate question every German soldier on the ground was asking themselves as they watched the sky fill with an impossible number of Allied aircraft. The answer was simple and devastating. For the most part, they were on the ground. Not just because of the weather, but because of years of grinding attrition. The air war over Europe had bled the Luftwaffe white. Constant brutal battles on the Eastern Front, combined with the Allies' relentless strategic bombing of German factories and synthetic oil refineries, had left it a hollowed-out shell of its former glory. Imagine being a young Luftwaffe pilot at an airfield just inland from the coast. You are 20 years old, trained and filled with patriotic fire. You can hear the unending drone of the enemy overhead, a sound that is an insult to your very existence as a fighter pilot. You run to your magnificent machine, a Focke-Wulf 190, arguably the finest fighter plane in the world. You climb into the cockpit, strap yourself in, ready to fight and die for your country. And then you look at the fuel gauge. The needle is on empty. And it's been on empty for over a week. That was the state of the Luftwaffe on D-Day. A handful of exceptionally brave pilots did take to the skies, flying directly into a wall of enemy aircraft. For every one German plane that managed to get airborne, there were more than 50 Allied planes waiting for it. It wasn't an air battle. It was a futile, heroic gesture. And the Navy. The once feared U-boats were mostly cowering in their bomb-proof concrete pens, useless against a naval force so heavily screened by destroyers and patrol aircraft. The English Channel, which the Germans called Der Kanal, was now for all intents and purposes an Allied lake. So you have this perfect storm of dysfunction. The most capable commander is away. The Air Force is grounded. The Navy is trapped. And most crucially, the Panzer divisions, the armored fists that could have driven the invaders straight back into the sea, were sitting idle in their depots miles from the coast, waiting for a telephone call from a Führer who was still asleep at his mountain home in Bavaria, and who had given his staff strict orders not to be disturbed before midday. The Atlantic Wall, for all its concrete and steel, was a magnificent suit of armor, with no one inside. It was a complex, interconnected defensive system where every single fuse had been removed just moments before the power surge hit. Slowly, frantically, the German military machine was starting to wake up. Telephones were ringing off the hook, telexes were clattering non-stop, but it was like watching a great groggy beast trying to stand. Its movements were slow, clumsy, and tragically late, and while the generals in Germany were frantically trying to find Rommel, and the pilots were staring hopelessly at their empty fuel gauges, the city of ghosts off the coast of Normandy had stopped its forward movement. It had found its position, and its thousands of cannons, large and small, were beginning to turn in terrifying unison towards the shore. And so they turned. Out on the gray, choppy water, the city of ghosts, the impossible fleet, had stopped its forward movement. Its journey was over, and in a terrifying silent unison, the great cannons of the Allied navies, from the massive 16-inch guns of battleships like the USS Texas to the smaller, faster-firing cannons of 100 destroyers, all took aim at the shore. For the men on the receiving end, there was a moment of surreal quiet, a held breath. They could see the distant flashes on the horizon like a summer lightning storm that had decided to visit on a cold June morning. A flicker of orange, then another and another. It was almost pretty in a strange, abstract way. But they were soldiers. They knew what came after the flash. They had just enough time to flatten themselves against the cold concrete floor to press their faces into the dirt. Then the sound arrived. It wasn't the sharp crack of field artillery they were used to. This was something else entirely. It began as a low rumble but quickly swelled into a deafening, tearing scream, as if the very fabric of the sky was being ripped apart. It was the sound of 100 freight trains, all made of pure thunder, all arriving at their station at the exact same instant. It was the sound of the world ending. Inside the bunker, the universe was reduced to noise and vibration. The solid earth, which had felt so permanent and reliable just moments before, began to shake and shudder violently, as if in the grip of a furious earthquake. The thick concrete walls, their trusted shield, groaned under the strain. Dust and small pebbles rained down from the ceiling, filling the air with a choking, gritty fog. The single naked light bulb flickered wildly, then winked out, plunging them into a strobing darkness, lit only by the apocalyptic flashes from outside the machine gun slit. For Klaus, for Manfred, the cynical veteran, for all of them, thought ceased to exist. There was no room for it. Their minds, which just hours before had been occupied with boredom, with memories of home, with the rules of a card game, were now wiped clean by the sheer, overwhelming volume. There was no strategy, no training that could prepare you for this. You didn't fight it. You didn't endure it. You were simply consumed by it. You curled into the smallest possible ball, covered your head with your arms, and prayed to a god you had probably forgotten about until this very moment. This wasn't a battle. It was a geological event. The shells, some weighing as much as a small car, weren't aimed at individual soldiers. They were aimed at coordinates on a map. They were sent to erase defenses, to flatten trenches, to shatter concrete, to turn the very landscape into a cratered alien moonscape. The men in the bunkers weren't facing human malice. They were facing physics delivered at supersonic speed. the Great Atlantic Wall, the symbol of German power. The structure that had given them such a false and fatal sense of security was being pulverized ton by ton. For 40 minutes, this storm of steel raged, a relentless, deafening, earth-shattering tantrum. It was designed to do one thing: to kill, to terrify, to stun, and to utterly demoralize any living thing on that stretch of coast. The Allied planners believed this overwhelming display of force would wipe the slate clean, leaving the beaches clear for the infantry to walk ashore. They couldn't know that deep inside the battered concrete tombs, in the ringing silence that would follow the final explosion, stunned and bleeding men like Klaus were still alive. They couldn't know that amidst the dust and the darkness, these men were slowly, shakily beginning to push themselves up their ears, screaming, their world turned upside down, and reaching for the cold, familiar steel of their rifles. The storm was over. But the real enemy, the one with a face and a gun, was on his way. And the fight for the beaches was only just beginning. And so the fight began. A desperate, brutal struggle on the sand in the shadow of the cliffs. But before we follow those soldiers into the fire and the chaos of the landings, let's do something else. Let's pull back. Let's allow the noise to fade for a moment and find a pocket of quiet in the heart of the storm. Let's leave the bunkers and the beaches and travel a few miles inland to a place where the war is not a strategic objective, but a terrifying, unwelcome guest. Let's find ourselves in the stone cellar of a Normandy farmhouse. Down here, it smells of damp earth, of aging apples from last year's harvest, and the faint, sweet scent of cider fermenting in a great wooden barrel. The world-ending thunder of the naval bombardment was felt here as a deep, continuous shudder, a vibration that rattled the jam jars on the shelves and sent fine streams of dust down from the floorboards above. An old farmer, a man we'll call Jean, has been sitting here in the dark on an overturned bucket since the sky began to tear apart. He is not thinking about victory or defeat. He is not thinking about nations or flags. He is thinking about his 3 cows who were in the field when the shaking began. He is thinking about the stain on the ceiling of his bedroom that is shaped like the map of France. He has seen war before as a boy in 1914. He knows that it is a storm that passes, a terrible fever that eventually breaks. All one can do is go down into the earth and wait. Now a new kind of silence has fallen. The great shaking has stopped. Hesitantly, Jean unbolts the heavy cellar door and pushes it open, squinting into the gray morning light. His world has been transformed. His ancient stone fence is a pile of rubble. His beloved apple orchard is a mess of splintered wood and torn leaves. The air is thick with a strange, acrid smoke. But then he sees it. In a patch of newly churned up earth, a single impossible thing. A wild red poppy, its stem bent but not broken, its delicate petals. A splash of defiant color against the gray and brown devastation. A small, silent testament that even in the face of industrial-scale destruction, life in its quiet, stubborn way holds on. Jean looks past the poppy out towards the landscape that has been his home for 70 years. Not a beach, but a labyrinth of small fields, sunken lanes, and ancient towering hedgerows. A peaceful green maze that was about to become a soldier's nightmare. The war had moved off the sand and was now coming for the fields. For the soldiers fighting here, the German defenders and the Allied invaders alike. The true struggle was about to begin, not on an open coastline, but in the green, claustrophobic heart of Normandy. Let us step into that green, claustrophobic heart. Let us follow the German soldier as he retreats from the shattered coastline and melts into the landscape that John, the old farmer, called home. This is the bocage, and for the men who fought there, it was a special kind of hell, a beautiful, sun-dappled nightmare. From a plane, it looks like a simple green quilt of fields and trees, but on the ground, it was a labyrinth. For centuries, Norman farmers had marked the boundaries of their small fields by building up thick earthen walls, some over 10 feet high. On top of these walls, they planted hedges of thorn ash and oak. Over generations, these hedges grew into dense, tangled monstrosities, their roots digging deep, turning each field into a self-contained natural fortress. The roads weren't roads. They were sunken lanes carved deep into the earth with high banks on either side, creating perfect channels for ambushes. For the German soldiers who survived the initial onslaught at the beaches, men like Klaus or the veteran Sergeant Manfred, the bocage was both a blessing and a curse. After the wide-open terror of the beaches where they were exposed to the full might of naval guns and air power, this enclosed terrain felt almost like a sanctuary. Here, technology was neutralized. An Allied fighter bomber was useless when the enemy was just on the other side of a hedge 50 yards away. A Sherman tank so formidable in the open became a loud, clumsy metal box blind at every corner. Here, a few determined men with a well-placed machine gun and a knowledge of the terrain could hold back a company. And the Germans were determined. Imagine a small squad of them, Lanzer nestled in a ditch on the shady side of a hedgerow. The summer air is hot and heavy. The world is deceptively peaceful. They hear the buzzing of flies, the chirping of crickets. They are exhausted, their uniforms caked in dirt and sweat. They don't talk. They listen. They are listening for the telltale clank of a GI's canteen, the snap of a twig, the low rumble of an approaching tank. Every rustle of leaves sends a jolt of adrenaline through their system. The silence is more nerve-wracking than any noise. Then they hear it. The squeal and clatter of tank treads coming down the sunken lane. A Sherman. It rounds the corner, its cannon probing ahead. The Germans don't move. They let it come closer. A young soldier no older than Klaus clutches a Panzerfaust, a simple single-shot anti-tank weapon. It is his only one. He has to wait. He lets the tank fill his entire world, its engine a deafening roar. He waits until he can see the grim, determined face of the American commander in the turret. Then, and only then, does he fire. There is a flash, a roar, and the world is smoke and fire and the horrifying shriek of tortured metal. The ambush is sprung. For 5, maybe 10 minutes, the peaceful lane is a storm of machine gun fire and grenade explosions. And then as quickly as it began, it is over. The survivors of the American patrol have pulled back. The lane is silent again, except for the crackling of the burning tank and the buzzing of the flies which have now found something new to interest them. This was the war in the bocage. Not a war of grand maneuvers, but 1,000 tiny, vicious fights for a single field. A single crossroads, a single stone bridge. It was a slow, meat-grinding war of attrition. The Germans fighting on the defensive became masters of this green labyrinth. They pre-sighted their mortars on the gaps in the hedges. They dug tunnels through the earthen walls to retreat and reappear somewhere else. They turned a peaceful agricultural landscape into a series of interlocking death traps. But for the individual German soldier, any sense of tactical advantage was drowned by a sea of constant gnawing fear. Paranoia became a survival tool. Every corner was a potential ambush. Every shadow could hold an enemy. Sleep came in snatched, fitful minutes, and the days bled into one another in a green haze of exhaustion and terror. For every field they successfully defended, for every tank they knocked out, they knew 10 more were on the way. They were bleeding the Allied armies, yes, but the Allies had more blood to spare. For every hedgerow cleared and every lane taken, there was a heavy price to be paid. A price counted not in territory, but in bodies. And this brutal accounting created a desperate, silent, and ever-growing need for another kind of soldier, the one who carried not a rifle, but a bag filled with bandages and morphine. Let's follow that soldier. The one with the red cross painted on his helmet, the one whose weapon is a canvas bag filled with bandages and morphine. He is the sanitator, the medic. And in the brutal mathematics of the bocage, his work never ever ends. His battlefield is not the hedgerow, but the aftermath. We find him in a small village church a few miles behind the shifting front line. It's a solid Romanesque building that has stood for 800 years, a silent witness to plagues, famines, and revolutions. Now it has become a makeshift aid station. The heavy oak doors are thrown open, and the pews have been pushed aside to make room for the wounded, who lie in neat, tragic rows on the cold stone floor, their heads resting on bundles of straw or their own rolled-up tunics. The air inside is thick and heavy. It smells of damp stone, of beeswax from the half-melted candles on the altar of antiseptic, and of the sharp, coppery tang of life spilled unwillingly onto the flagstones. Above, the serene painted faces of saints stare down from the stained glass windows, casting pools of ruby and sapphire light onto the suffering below. Our medic, a man we'll call Eric, moves through this somber tableau. Before the war, he was a medical student in Heidelberg, dreaming of becoming a surgeon. Now he is the sole arbiter of life and death in this small sacred space. His face is a mask of profound exhaustion, his movements economical and practiced. He kneels beside a soldier, a boy from his own company. He doesn't need to ask what happened. The shredded uniform and the crude, bloody field dressing tell the story. A mortar fragment. Eric's hands, though trembling slightly from lack of sleep, are gentle. With a pair of scissors, he carefully cuts away the cloth. He cleans the wound with a precious splash of water from his canteen, hissing a quiet apology as the man flinches. He sprinkles the precious white dust of sulfa powder, the miracle drug that staves off infection, then skillfully wraps a clean white bandage around the wound, turning the chaotic red mess into a neat, contained package. The work is precise, methodical. It is a ritual against the chaos. He moves to the next man and the next, each one a small island of pain. He offers a sip of water, a shared cigarette, a quiet word of reassurance. For a soldier with a shattered hand, he can only offer a bandage and a sling. For another whose eyes are wide and vacant, with the terror of shell shock, he can only sit with him for a moment, place a steadying hand on his shoulder, and speak his name, until the soldier seems to see him to return from whatever far-off hell his mind has retreated to. Then he comes to a boy no older than 17, his face pale and feverish. The boy is whispering, calling for his mother. Eric knows there is little he can do. The wound in the boy's stomach is too severe. There is no surgery here, no hospital. So Eric performs the last, most vital service a medic can offer. He takes a syringe of morphine from his bag, a small disposable needle of mercy. He administers the dose, and then he simply kneels, takes the boy's hand, and waits with him. He listens to the whispered words about a home in Bavaria, about a dog named Fritz. He watches as the pain recedes from the boy's face, as the tension leaves his body replaced by a drifting foggy peace. He holds the hand until it goes limp. Then he straightens his aching back, whispers a quiet, "Forgive me," and moves to the next man who is calling his name. This is the medic's burden. He cannot save them all. He is a healer forced to perform triage to make the impossible calculation of who has a chance and who does not. For the wounded men lying in the cool, silent church, the war is temporarily paused, held at bay by these thick stone walls. But outside, the distant rattle of machine gun fire sounds a little closer than it did an hour ago. The front line is not a line at all. It is a fluid, moving thing. And for Eric and his patients, a new, unspoken fear begins to creep into the sacred space. What happens when the battle moves on, when the line is redrawn, and a place of sanctuary becomes captured territory? What happens to the wounded when the enemy appears in the church doorway? The question hangs in the dusty, sacred air of the church. What happens when the enemy appears in the doorway? The great oak door groans open, flooding the dim space with harsh daylight. Silhouetted against the light are two figures. Their helmets are the wrong shape. They are not German. They are American GIs, rifles held at the ready, their eyes wide and wary, scanning the room for any sign of a trap. Inside, a wave of cold fear washes over the wounded men. For Eric the medic, it's a moment of truth. He slowly stands, his hands raised to show they are empty, his Red Cross armband clearly visible. He is the guardian of this broken flock, and his duty is to them. For the conscious German soldiers, this is the moment they have been trained for and have secretly dreaded. The end of the line. Let's find Klaus again, our young soldier from the bunker. He survived the beach. He survived the bocage, but a piece of American shrapnel found him in a ditch yesterday. He's lying on a bed of straw, his leg bandaged, a feverish haze dulling his senses. He sees the strange helmets, the unfamiliar uniforms. His hand instinctively tightens on the rough wool of his blanket, searching for the rifle that is no longer there. A jolt of pure animal terror surges through him. This is it. He is helpless. This is how it ends. But it doesn't end. One of the GIs, a sergeant with a tired, weathered face, takes in the scene, the rows of wounded, the smell of antiseptic, the lone, unarmed medic. He lowers his rifle slightly and mutters something to his companion. An American medic, his own canvas bag looking remarkably similar to Eric's, steps forward. He walks towards Eric, not as a conqueror, but as a professional. He gestures to Eric's bag, then to his own, a silent question passing between them. What do you need? And in that moment, as Klaus watches this silent professional courtesy, a new feeling begins to dawn, pushing aside the terror. It's a feeling so unexpected, so contrary to everything he has been told that it takes him a moment to even recognize it. It is relief. A profound, bone-deep, and utterly overwhelming sense of relief. Suddenly, the immense weight of the war, a weight he had been carrying every second of every day for months, simply lifts from his shoulders. He no longer has to fight. He no longer has to worry about the next mortar shell, the next ambush in a sunken lane. He no longer has to kill anyone. He no longer has to die for a cause he was beginning to understand less and less. He has lost, and in losing, he has been saved. For him, the war is over. A young GI, maybe only a year or two older than Klaus, is assigned to guard his section of the church. He walks over not with aggression, but with a tired curiosity. He looks at Klaus, and Klaus looks back. Yesterday, they were ideological enemies, faceless targets to be eliminated. Today, they are just two boys caught on opposite sides of a historical hurricane, now sharing the same quiet, exhausted space. The GI wordlessly unclips his canteen and offers it to Klaus. Klaus takes it, his hands shaking, and drinks the cool, clean American water. It is the single most delicious thing he has ever tasted. This is the strange reality of surrender. It is not the heroic Wagnerian last stand from the propaganda films. It is not the monstrous fate promised by his officers. It is quiet. It is awkward. It is strangely, bewilderingly human. The German soldiers are systematically disarmed. Their few remaining weapons and equipment are piled in a corner of the church, a small monument to a defeated force. They are no longer soldiers of the Third Reich. They are now prisoners of war, a number, a piece of human logistics to be managed. It is a demotion, a stripping away of identity. But for the men lying on the floor of this ancient church, it is a demotion they will gratefully accept. It is the price of living until tomorrow. This quiet, almost gentle transition was nothing like what the radios back home were reporting. The official broadcasts spoke only of glorious resistance and fanatical last stands. The reality of defeat was far stranger, and the humanity of the enemy was a truth too complex for the propaganda machine to ever admit. Klaus's war was over, but a new uncertain journey was just beginning. A journey on foot or by truck away from the front line into a future of barbed wire, of long empty days, and the slow, agonizing process of waiting for the real journey home. Let's leave Klaus and the captured soldiers in the quiet of their church for a moment. Let's leave the sharp, undeniable reality of defeat and travel through the airwaves back to the German Reich to listen to what that incredibly powerful propaganda machine was actually saying. Because the humanity of the enemy, the quiet relief of surrender, that was a truth too complex and too dangerous for public consumption. Picture a family in a Berlin apartment. The blackout curtains are drawn, turning the mid-afternoon sun into a gloomy twilight. A mother and her young son sit listening to the Volksempfänger, the people's radio, their only source of news from the front. The grandfather, a veteran of the Great War, sits in his armchair, his face skeptical. They are listening for the daily Wehrmachtbericht, the official armed forces report. A grand, heroic fanfare plays, and then a crisp, confident announcer's voice fills the room. It's the evening of June 6th. "Attention, attention," the voice declares. In Normandy, the enemy began his long-announced invasion this morning. These landing attempts at several points on the coast between Le Havre and Cherbourg have been met with the toughest resistance from our naval, air, and ground forces. The enemy, who suffered exceptionally high and bloody losses, was thrown back into the sea at numerous points before he could even reach the shore. The battle is ongoing. In the Berlin apartment, the mother lets out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Her son looks up at her, his eyes wide with patriotic pride. Thrown back into the sea. It sounds like a great victory. Only the grandfather stares at the radio, his expression unchanged. He knows the difference between a battle report and the truth. We know the truth too. We know Major Pluscats ignored warnings. We know the sky was black with Allied planes. We know the beaches were being pulverized by a fleet so large it defied description. But for millions of Germans, the reality was what the radio told them it was. A week later, the Allies are firmly ashore and fighting in the bocage. The radio can no longer claim the invasion has been repelled. So the narrative shifts. The announcer's voice is now grave but still confident. In the difficult hedgerow terrain south of Bayeux, he reads, "Our heroic grenadiers are engaged in a heroic defensive struggle, inflicting horrific losses on the enemy. In brutal close quarters, fighting the Americans and British are paying for every meter of ground with a river of blood. Our forces are performing planned withdrawals to stronger defensive lines, making the enemy's advance a tactical and strategic failure. A defeat is magically transformed into a brilliant fighting retreat. A desperate struggle for survival is spun into a story of German martial prowess, bleeding the enemy dry. And then, as the news from Normandy becomes undeniably grim, the propaganda machine performs its greatest trick. It changes the subject. The announcer's voice suddenly becomes electric with excitement. He speaks of a new weapon, a Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapon, the V1 flying bomb. Retaliation has begun, he proclaims. For days our new secret weapon has been striking at the heart of the enemy, bringing the terror of war to the city of London itself. The Führer's promise has been kept. The English will now feel the same pain they have inflicted on our beloved German cities. For the family in Berlin who have spent countless nights in air raid shelters, this is the news they have been praying for. Finally, Germany is striking back. It's a powerful, intoxicating narrative. It offers hope. It offers revenge. And most importantly, it distracts from the fact that the entire German Western Army is being systematically crushed in France. The German soldiers fighting and dying in the bocage never heard these broadcasts. They were living the truth. The dwindling ammunition, the missing air support the endless waves of Allied men and material. The lies flowing from the radio were no longer for them. They were for the people at home, a fantasy spun to keep the factories running, to keep morale from collapsing, to keep the vast, complex machinery of a nation at war from grinding to a halt. But the V1s flying towards London couldn't stop the Sherman tanks grinding through the hedgerows of Normandy. And while the radio spoke of glorious retaliation, the reality for the defeated German soldier was not a heroic counterattack, but a long, silent walk to the west. In the end, the war would not be decided by what was said over the radio, but by the cold, hard facts on the ground. And those facts in their hundreds of thousands were now marching away from the front line and into an unknown future. Let us follow those facts on the ground. Let us leave the fantasy of the airwaves and join that long, silent march into the unknown future. This is the journey that propaganda never shows. It is the long walk of the defeated. There are thousands of them. A slow-moving river of gray-green uniforms shuffling west away from the battle they have just lost. This is no military procession. There is no rhythm, no cadence. Just the sound of shuffling boots, of dragging feet, of utter bone-deep exhaustion. The column is guarded by a handful of American GIs who look almost as tired as the men they are guarding. Their rifles are slung casually over their shoulders. The fight is over. This is now just a problem of administration. The prisoners walk through the battlefield they have just spent weeks defending. It's a surreal and demoralizing tour of their own failure. They pass the blackened husk of a Panther tank, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, now sitting dead and useless in a ditch, its cannon pointing accusingly at the sky. They pass abandoned machine gun nests littered with spent cartridges. They walk past the splintered apple orchards and ruined farmhouses where their friends had died just days before. The landscape is a freshly written history of their own defeat, and they are being forced to read every word. The column shuffles into a small, rubble-strewn French village. The villagers emerge from their homes to watch them pass. Their faces are a mixture of emotions. Some glare with a cold, hard hatred that has been simmering for 4 years under occupation. A few children too young to understand simply stare with wide-eyed curiosity. Most, however, just watch with a kind of weary indifference. To them, this is just another army passing through an old and tired story in the life of their ancient village. But then, a small moment of grace occurs so unexpected it feels like a dream. An old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, steps out from the small crowd. She looks at the passing faces, so many of them just boys pale with fear and exhaustion. Her eyes land on a young prisoner, a boy who looks like her own grandson. She pushes through the crowd and holds out a small, wrinkled apple. The boy who could be our Klaus flinches at first, expecting a blow. He sees the apple and stares, his mind unable to process the gesture. An American guard sees the exchange, hesitates for a moment, and then gives a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The boy takes the apple, his hand trembling. He manages a quiet, choked, "Danke." The old woman says nothing, simply pats his arm and melts back into the crowd. For the briefest of moments, the uniforms, the flags, and the war itself disappear, leaving only a single unexplainable act of human kindness. This is the new reality for the German prisoner. The world is no longer divided into friend and enemy, but into a series of strange, unpredictable human encounters. The guards are no longer targets, but bored young men who might occasionally share a cigarette or a piece of a chocolate bar. They complain about the food, about the rain, about their sergeants. The German prisoners listen and realize their enemies are just as tired of the war as they are. Finally, the column crests a hill, and below them is the sea. They are back on the invasion beaches, but the beaches have been utterly transformed. The wreckage of the landings is still there, but it has been pushed to the side to make way for vast, sprawling enclosures of barbed wire. Inside these cages are tens of thousands of men, a sea of gray uniforms sitting or lying on the sand waiting. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the German defeat is laid bare before their eyes. Klaus, or a boy just like him, is herded into one of these pens. He finds a space on the sand and sits down, the apple from the old woman held carefully in his hands. He looks out at the same English Channel he had stared at from his bunker what feels like a lifetime ago. Then he was a guardian of a fortress waiting for an enemy to arrive from the sea. Now he is a prisoner on that same shore waiting for a ship to appear on the horizon and take him away. The war had come full circle. For him it was truly over. But while an entire German army was now being held in these vast open-air waiting rooms on the coast of France back in the Reich, the radio was still telling its stories of heroic resistance, and the war machine, though mortally wounded, would continue to grind on for almost another year. The tide of war had turned, but it would take a long, long time to finally go out. And eventually, the tide of war did go out. It receded from the beaches of Normandy, flowing east across France, a destructive wave grinding its way towards the German border. So let us leave the shuffling columns of prisoners and the dissonant voices on the radio. Let us jump forward in time just a few months and return to where our entire story began. The quiet, lonely coast. The year is still 1944, but the frantic, violent energy of June has bled into the melancholic light of early autumn. The air has a new chill to it. The great logistical machine of the invasion has moved on, leaving the beaches and the cliffs behind like a traveling circus that has packed up its tents and vanished in the night. The coast has become a backwater once again. It has gone quiet. Let's take a walk on that quiet shore. The sand is wide and flat, washed clean by 100 tides since the invasion. But the ghosts remain. Here and there, the skeletal remains of a Higgins boat lie half buried in the wet sand, its wooden ramp pointing towards the land like a broken finger. Further up the beach, a line of German tank traps. Those giant metal jacks are slowly being encrusted with barnacles and rust, their sharp, brutalist angles softened by the sea's patient embrace. A knocked-out Sherman tank sits silently at the edge of a dune sand, piled up against its tracks, its cannon now a convenient perch for seabirds. It's the small things that catch the eye. A single waterlogged leather boot, its laces undone, lying in a tide pool. A rusted helmet shaped like a shallow bowl half filled with rainwater. A scattered handful of letters, their ink long since washed away by the summer rains, their words and feelings returned to the elements. These are the last quiet whispers of the thousands of lives that collided here. Let's climb the dune away from the beach and approach one of the German bunkers, the one we might imagine belonged to Klaus. It is silent now, utterly, profoundly silent. The thick steel door has been blown from its hinges and lies twisted on the ground. We step inside, and our footsteps echo in the cold, cavernous space. The air smells of damp concrete, of decay, and of the sea. The chaos of battle has been replaced by the quiet mess of abandonment. Empty shell casings litter the floor like brass pebbles. A discarded gas mask canister lies in a corner, its filter long since expired. On the wall, a charcoal drawing of a buxom woman, a soldier's lonely fantasy, is now peeling away in the damp. Someone has scratched a name and a date on the concrete. Kilroy was here. A ghost leaving his mark on a tomb. We walk to the machine gun slit, the very same one Klaus stared out of during that long final night of peace. We look out. But there is no impossible fleet on the horizon. There is no city of ghosts. There is only the vast empty expanse of the English Channel, gray and indifferent, stretching out to meet the sky. The bunker, a structure built at enormous expense for a single violent purpose, is now condemned to an eternity of this quiet, unchanging view. Its war lasted only a few hours. Its peace will last for as long as the concrete holds. And all around it, nature is patiently, persistently reclaiming its own. Bright yellow wildflowers are blooming in the green grass that has grown over the lip of a shell crater. Ivy has begun to creep up the bunker's concrete face, its green tendrils softening the hard military lines. The earth is covering its scars. The trenches dug in such a frantic hurry are slowly slumping, their sharp edges eroding back into the gentle contours of the land. The coast had gone quiet. The great violent scream of history had faded to a whisper carried on the wind. These bunkers, these rusting hulks, they were not just debris, they were becoming something else. They were the first seeds of memory, the raw materials from which the future would try to make sense of the past. And that whisper would settle deep into the concrete and the steel, waiting patiently for new generations to come and listen. And we are that new generation. We have come to listen. Let us travel one last time, not back into the violence of the past, but forward all the way to today. Let's stand on that same Normandy coast, not in the gray dawn of 1944, but in the warm golden light of a summer afternoon right now. The beach, once a landscape of terror and death, is alive with a different kind of invasion, an invasion of brightly colored towels and beach umbrellas. The air, once thick with smoke and fear, now carries the scent of sunscreen and saltwater taffy. The sound is not of screaming shells, but of children's laughter as they dare the waves to chase them. The sheer, overwhelming, beautiful normalcy of it all is the greatest tribute one could imagine. Let's walk up the dunes past the neatly maintained lawns and the respectful memorials and find our way back to that same concrete bunker. It's still here, of course. It's as permanent as a mountain. But it has been tamed by time. The grass around it is mowed. A small discreet plaque might tell you its official designation, Regelbau 6967. It is no longer a weapon of war. It is an artifact, a historical site. Imagine you are there now. Go ahead and step inside. The air is still cool and damp, and it still smells of old, cold concrete. But the space feels different, less threatening. Run your hand over the rough interior wall. It's pitted and scarred, a braille map of history. Feel the same cool sea breeze that Klaus once felt drifting through the machine gun slit. Now, just for a moment, close your eyes. Let the sounds of the happy beach fade away. Let the modern world recede, and just listen. Listen with more than your ears. Listen past the wind and the waves. If you listen closely in the deep, profound silence of this concrete shell, you can almost hear the echoes. It is not the roar of battle you hear. It is something much quieter. It's the echo of a nervous shuffle of boots on the floor. The echo of a deck of worn-out playing cards being dealt. The echo of the scratch of a pen on cheap paper composing a letter of gentle lies to a mother far away. Listen. You can hear the low, anxious murmur of young men trying to guess what the strange droning sound in the sky is. You can feel the ghost of a vibration in the ground as the first shells of a distant, impossible fleet begin to fall. These are the echoes of the boys who waited here. Boys who were bored and scared and homesick and who were asked to do an impossible thing on a single summer morning. This bunker, built as a tool of hatred and defiance, failed in its military purpose. Its guns did not stop the tide of history. But in its long, quiet retirement, it has succeeded in a new mission. It has become a place of memory, a silent, patient teacher. Its lesson is in the profound contrast between the violent echoes within its walls and the sound of children laughing on the sand outside. The peace that exists here now, the simple freedom to enjoy a summer's day, is the legacy of the violence that once consumed it. The greatest victory was not military. The greatest victory is this peace. The story of that long day and the German soldiers who saw it from this side of the hill is over now. They have found their rest one way or another. Klaus the boy who worried about his mother's baking. Manfred the cynical veteran who had seen too much. Eric the medic who brought comfort to a dying boy in a church, their watch is over. They have all faded back into the strange and quiet corners of the past. Their struggles are history. Their fears are just echoes. And for you here now, in the safety and the quiet of your room, there is only peace. Let the images of the story soften and drift away. Let the sound of the waves on the Normandy shore soothe you. The coast is quiet now, and so is the world around you. All that is left to do is rest. Thank you for listening to Sleep Among Titans. Now, just sleep.